Let us pray. Eternal God, in the reading of the Scripture, may your word be heard. In the meditations of our hearts, may your word be known, and in the faithfulness of our lives, may your word be shown. Amen. One of my favorite films is Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark. I think the opening of it is probably my favorite. However, the climactic scene in Raiders of the Lost Ark, so if you haven't seen it, I'm sorry, but when the Nazis open the Ark and they see the presence of God. In biblical times, it was thought that if you were too close to God's glory, you would be burned to death by that radiance. And in contemporary usage, that often is the case as well. However, sometimes it has a slightly different shift to it. And it's a shift that I find interesting. It's the shift towards talking about what burns away those things that need to be burned away within us. That we can't touch the red-hot gospel. Something happens within the Holy Spirit is within us, and it feels like we get burnt. I prefer to talk about it in terms of transformation, of being transformed. But there are times that I'm reluctant to go to the Bible because I really don't want to be changed. I want to do it more in my own time, so sometimes I neglect to do that. Because whenever we encounter God, whether it is in nature, in the words of Scripture, in the presence of others, there should be that sense that our heart burns within us because we have been in the presence of the Holy. Dick, you talked about it last week when you talked about that sense of being transformed by Jesus and that phrase that you've used over and over again about that whenever the minister, and I think it's anyone who gets excited about Jesus, your heart leaps. And you said last week, and it still does, doesn't it? Our hearts should leap. Kurt Kaiser wrote these words, "It only takes a spark to get a fire going, and soon all those around can warm up to its glowing. That's how it is with God's love. Once you've experienced it, you spread God's love to everyone you want." And I think I'd change that to say you need to pass it on. I mean, it's a huge risk journeying into relationship with this awesome and mysterious God. A relationship that might take us into new places, experiencing new people, will change how we look at the world. And yes, even at times it may leave us angry and heartbroken. I mean, look at Moses and his relationship with God and with the people. Now, last week we would have talked about the Ten Commandments coming down the mountain the first time and the golden calf. It's a very violent and scary story that talks about the wrath of the people and the wrath of God. We don't often like to talk about wrath or anger. But in this particular story, we're trying to figure out what it means to be in relationship with this God. I mean, where has your relationship with God taken you? What are the new people, the new situations that you've encountered? What experiences have you shared because of this relationship? And what relationships have you developed that you might not have if it wasn't for God's presence. But new perspectives might not have been transformed. Moses longs to know the name of God, right from the very beginning of the story. And he longs over and over again to experience God's presence, even though within that presence he has no problem arguing with God and reminding God of God's promises. He says, to paraphrase, "You give me this monumental responsibility, but you leave me guessing as to how to accomplish it. You say that I've found favor in your sight, but right now I feel very vulnerable. You say that you will go with us, but if you will not be there too, then do not send us." This tension between God's presence and God's absence that we still experience even today. Moses has an urgent need for God to be there, to show up. Most of us have cried out in those moments of great need. God, I need you. I need you to speak. I need you to come. I need to feel your presence somehow, not in some hidden or veiled way. I need to know that you're here. I need to know your will. I need to know it now. Timothy Hare, the Reverend Timothy Hare, tells this story. He says, "I'm reminded of a young woman who was forced to make a very difficult decision, a decision that she felt was hugely important, one that would change the course of her life forever. At first she prayed calmly and gently, hoping that clarity from God would come. It did not. As time went by, the young woman grew more concerned, moved from concern to stress, to panic, to angry. God, you say you love me. You say you care about my life. You say you are here for me. Where are you? Speak. Shout up." And the young woman resolved that if she couldn't get an answer, she was going to go into her room and stay there until she heard a clear answer. And it wasn't long, to her surprise, before she received her answer. God showed up in an entirely moment of clarity, an entire moment of clarity that she'll never forget. God did not tell her what to do in regard to the decision she had to make. However, as she describes it, God became intimately present to me. God graced my angst-filled silence with calm and peace and told me again and again and again and again, I love you. It seemed that God perceived a more urgent question. God addressed a more important matter. And suddenly the young woman's question, which had previously been so pressing, could wait. Moses' ultimate request to see God's glory is a reminder to us all that the most precious gift we are given is the gift of God's very self. Simon Tugwell, some time ago in 1975, is when the book was published, Prayer, Living with God, makes a very important point. And it's a point about the power and weakness of God. He writes, "We had thought of God as the dispenser of all the good things we would possibly desire. But in a very real sense, God has nothing to give at all except himself. God has only the one thing to say, which is himself. He has only the one thing to give, which is himself. And he writes and he invites us to hear that word, to treasure it into our hearts, and to find it as the source of all our bliss. And the language is dated, but we get to the point. Latin American theologian Gustavo Gutierrez wrote, "To believe in God is more than simply to profess God's existence. It is to enter into communion with God, and the two being inseparable with our fellow human beings as well. As Gutierrez suggests, we know that God is with us when we feel love for one another, when we give love to one another." David Friend of the Canadian Press wrote an important article this week. Canada mourns, Gord's gone. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau was in tears as he paid tribute to Downey and how he devoted the last chapter of his life to advocating for the rights of Canada's Indigenous peoples. He loved every hidden corner, every story, every aspect of this country, Trudeau said. He wanted to make it better. He knew, as great as we were, we need to be better than we are. That's why this last year has been devoted to Chani Wenchak and to reconciliation. This is something I've certainly drawn inspiration and strength from. We are less without Gord Downey. In the aftermath of the shocking May 2016 announcement that Downey had been diagnosed with terminal brain cancer, the band said it would mount a tour, which many assume would be a goodbye tour, and used it to focus more attention on issues facing Indigenous communities in Canada. The CBC broadcast the last show of the live tour in the Hips' hometown of Kingston, Ontario. Millions of fans watched that. I watched on Friday night. If you had the opportunity to do so, it was a powerful documentary, long time running, about Gord. Gord used the national platform to call more attention to the inequalities faced by the Indigenous people of Canada, the First Nations of Canada, particularly in the north. Gord Downey said in the concert just before beginning the Man Machine solo, "We're in good hands, folks, real good hands," Downey said in reference to Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. He cares about the people way up north that we are trained our entire lives to ignore, trained our entire lives to hear not a word of what's going on up there. And what's going on up there ain't good. It's maybe worse than it's ever been. So it's not on the improve, but we're going to get it fixed, and we got the guy to do it, to start, to help. I've been speaking recently with someone who works with Indigenous affairs within the Canadian government, and the person gave the sentiment that really what we need to be doing is less talking and more action. And just to give it an example, there's over 100 communities in the north that still do not have adequate drinking water, clean drinking water. About 2 months after the concert, Downey released the multimedia solo project Secret Path, which recounted the life of 12-year-old Chani Wenchak. He says, "My dream would be that this record, with Jeff Lemare's drawings, might help people, might give teachers something to help teach our young ones. In December of last year, the Assembly of First Nations honored Gord by making him an honorary brother. His Indigenous name is the man who walked among the stars. Perhaps his passion can become our passion. Hopefully, history may liken his tour and this particular work as being like the Terry Fox legacy, where something special begins. Come and join that conversation. I mean, not just this Sunday afternoon, but ongoing conversation. As our moderator has said, it begins with relationship. It begins with relationship. I mean, do as Gord Downie challenges all of us to do on Canada Day 150, when he talked about beginning the next 150 years as 7 generations of healing and reconciliation, of doing the work. Moses longed to see the presence of God, and he was held in the cleft of the rock. He was held in that presence. We long to see the presence of God, but part of being held means that we must be transformed by those encounters. I mean, Gord Downie said that it's Trudeau's job, and that's a way to get started, but he was also very clear that it's not just the government's job. It's our job. It's our job. Amen.